Right ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dennis. The question that I want to take up is that following the Biden-Putin summit on Pearl Harbor Day, it appears as though there's been somewhat of a de-escalation. We were clearly in a moment of incredible tension, which was largely built up by an intense psychological warfare campaign coming out of Washington, coming out of the City of London, and out of Brussels, out of NATO, but with talks of Russian troops on the border, a Russian offensive being prepared. On December 3rd, there was a leak from the intelligence community that was in the Washington Post saying various figures, 170, 180,000, maybe 250,000 Russian troops on the border, and no one knew what Putin was planning. But they assumed that he was planning an invasion. And the talk said that between the end of January and mid-February, there might be a Russian invasion into Ukraine. Now, from reports on the summit that occurred, the video conference, it does appear as though a bit of a de-escalation is underway. So the question has to be asked then, why is Helga Zeppler saying that we are still sitting on a powder keg? And that's what I want to discuss in my presentation today. I mean, what we know from the discussion that took place at the summit is that both leaders said what they wanted to say. Putin said his piece, making the case for Russia's concern about NATO expansion, the violation of the pledge made in February 1990 that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. He wanted a written guarantee that would occur now, no further eastward expansion, concern with the military buildup of NATO in Ukraine, and also the asking for Western guarantees to live up to the Normandy format of the Minsk Accord, which would have included a Ukrainian commitment to discussion of what's going on in eastern Ukraine, which the Kiev government has refused to do. That's what Putin mentioned. Biden put his piece forward. You should not invade. We're not going to accept it. We don't accept red lines. There will be serious consequences if you do invade Ukraine, especially economic consequences. And there's a unified NATO that's committed to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, which is interesting because one wonders where that defense of Ukrainian sovereignty was in February 2014, when the US, the British, and NATO pulled off a coup against a democratically elected government. But Biden, for his part, then said the US would not launch a strike, would not attack. And then he said the US would engage in what was later called a larger diplomatic outreach with Putin, our European allies, and Ukraine to discuss Putin's concern, especially with NATO deployment, NATO enlargement, and the Normandy format diplomacy. Now, also, it's the case that there are continuing progress being made by diplomatic working groups that were set up from the Zurich summit between Biden and Putin. Working groups taking up questions such as the INF treaty, deployment in Eastern Europe, the situation around the Black Sea, and so on. And these diplomatic working groups also include networks that one of the people involved in it is CIA Director William Burns, who is somewhat trusted by the Russians as a senior figure. Burns himself said that in contrast to those people who asserted that we know Putin wants to invade, Burns repeatedly said we don't know that Putin intends to invade. We don't have any clarity on that. And he also said that there are fewer troops than have been reported. I think he said there are 70,000, not 150 or 250,000 troops. And he did say that the continuing dialogue would go on with the working groups. But with all that said, pointing toward a de-escalation, the U.S. is continuing flights, and NATO are continuing flights along the Russian border, including with nuclear-capable bombers, that is, bombers that can carry nuclear weapons, that are within a few minutes of Moscow. There are also naval maneuvers in the Black Sea, a NATO buildup overall, including Poland, the Baltic states, and weapons being delivered to Ukraine. And then on top of that, some highly provocative comments that seem to go against the idea of de-escalation, including from some of the people who were there with Biden, such as Secretary of State Blinken, who every chance he gets talks about serious economic consequences, high risk action for Putin if he does do anything, and especially talks about Russia's violations of the rules-based order. Now, on top of that, then you have voices coming out very clearly for war with Russia. Most prominent was Senator Wicker, the number 2 man in the Senate Armed Forces Committee, Wicker from Mississippi, who said that if Russia doesn't back down, we should stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and rain down destruction on Russia. He said, I would not rule out troops on the ground. And he said, we don't rule out the first use nuclear option. This from a senator who's high of importance in the Senate Armed Services Committee. You have Ted Cruz, who's known to shoot off his mouth without thinking. But Cruz said that if Putin invades Ukraine, it's Biden's fault. And he said the reason is Biden surrendered on Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that provides natural gas, once it's certified and open, from Russia to Germany and Western Europe. And he also said that Biden waived the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which is why Russia is now encouraged that they can do what they want. Now, I could say more about Nord Stream 2. I mean, basically, the idea, if you sanction Russia and don't allow the gas, who are you punishing? You're punishing our Western allies, especially Germany. In Germany, we're experiencing a very cold early winter. We're moving away from nuclear technology, moving away from coal. If you shut down natural gas, and you already have 40 to 50% increase in utility costs in Germany, what you're doing is starving, or rather freezing, one of our allies. So how is that an effective punishment of Russia? And by the way, Ted Cruz, who never stops talking about his commitment to free trade, one wonders where that stands when he endorses these kinds of sanctions. 22 House members from both parties called for sanctions against Nord Stream 2 and also called for delivering defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, the notorious State Department operative who was on the scene at the Maidan Square in 2014, a major coordinator with Joe Biden, and by the way, with Blinken as well, in the Maidan Square massacre that led to the regime change in Ukraine in 2014, under questioning from Marco Rubio, another war hawk senator from Florida. Rubio said there are 3 points he wanted to make. We should not pull back NATO forces from the Russian border. We should not rule out admission of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO, and we should not stop arming Ukraine. And he asked Nuland if she agrees with that, and she said absolutely on all 3. Then you have Michelle Flournoy, who was slated to become Secretary of Defense under Biden until it became clear that she was nothing but an operative for the military-industrial complex. She was explicit in calling for Russia to be kicked out of the SWIFT system, which is the safe and secure financial transaction system that if Russia were kicked out of, it would probably have a profound effect on Russia, but also the whole financial system, as I think Paul may be talking about, is extremely fragile and weak right now and could trigger across-the-board defaults. And then, of course, you have people like Adam Schiff and the anti-Russian crowd in the Democratic Party who came out saying you can't trust Putin, and Schiff in particular praised the idea of the Summit for Democracy as necessary to counter Putin. And I'll talk about that in a moment, the Summit for Democracy. But it's worth noting there were voices speaking out against war. And this is significant because until recently, there had been very few voices warning of the danger of nuclear war. One of the most important international voices raising that question has been Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute. And what Helga has been warning is that these kinds of this kind of rhetoric and these kinds of deployments, the constant crisscrossing of borders and flying up to the airspace of other countries with nuclear-capable bombers, it's a small accident away from triggering a response which could lead to a nuclear war. She had been one of the few voices raising that repeatedly. But in the aftermath of the recent buildup, the December buildup toward war, the psychological warfare exercise conducted by intelligence services in the transatlantic region, Tulsi Gabbard spoke up once again. And she said that anyone saying what Senator Wicker said about preparing a first strike nuclear attack must be, quote, insane, a sociopath, or a sadist, unquote. I would say all three. But then she made the point, he's not an outlier. He's the number 2 person in the Republican Senate Armed Forces Committee. That the same language is coming from Democrats and Republicans in Congress, she said, as well as from some in the administration, as well as from the media. And she concluded her comments saying, we're being pushed closer and closer to a hot war, a nuclear war, by the same neocons and neoliberals in Washington, responsible for the regime change wars in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Now, one of the places she said this was on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox, and Carlson echoed Helga Zepp-LaRouche, saying, no one should think that a nuclear war is not possible. Now, there's another reaction that's occurred since the summit, and we're just beginning to get a reading on this, but it appears as though there's a certain amount of panic in British circles. What if Biden actually does pursue diplomatic compromise or diplomatic agreement with Vladimir Putin on these questions that are driving us toward war? And this was reflected in a headline in the Daily Telegraph, one of the leading war publications in the city of London. The headline was, Biden's offer for talks to avert Russian invasion is a big win for Putin. And that's a talking point among Republicans, including Donald Trump. And then there's an Intel News, which is a business publication, which said Putin wins concession from Biden. So you have these kinds of comments coming out, and I'll just point out one other one. Annalena Baerbock, the new foreign minister in Germany, who seems eager to put forward the idea of a nuclear-capable Germany stepping up to defend freedom in Ukraine. She's from the Green Party, which was once a peace party, but which is now identifying itself with the most extreme war hawks in the West. And this is a very ominous development, which seems to go against Germany's tradition of not encouraging war, given its location in Europe. Germany is not that far from Ukraine. Now, with this as a background, let's take a look quickly at this stunt that was carried off the last couple of days called the Summit for Democracy. And I say it's a stunt because really it's a cover for what you might call a new wrinkle in British geopolitics. The key to British geopolitics is a division of the world into 2 empires. This is what they did after World War II, the idea of the US and NATO versus Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Warsaw Pact. When that collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1990, what was put forward was that we could now have a unipolar world in which the power of the West, the transatlantic, especially in the hands of the United States and NATO, would be the determinant of all policy in the future, economic policy, strategic policy, and so on. The idea of a unipolar world. a unilateral decision-making process which every other country had to adhere to. This is really the origin of the modern conception of the rules-based order. There are no real rules in it because the so-called rules that are defined by international treaties, the United Nations Charter, and so on, are repeatedly rejected by the policies of the transatlantic powers, particularly the United States and NATO, in launching the endless wars that we've been seeing. But the division of the world into two camps now, the Summit for Democracy basically says you have the democratic world and then you have the autocrats, the authoritarian regimes, including Russia, China, Iran, Nicaragua, Venezuela. They identify a few others. And they invited 130 or so countries to this summit, including a number of countries which are not exactly very democratic. Where did this come from? Well, I've been doing a little digging on it, and the origin seems to be from the State Department policy planning staff in 2008. The idea was first presented then. Now, of course, that was the end of the Bush regime, when George W. Bush famously said after 2001, after the terror attack of 9/11, you're either for us or against us. That's the division of the world. You either join our fight against terrorism or else you're with the terrorists. Now, that included endless wars, but it also included the establishment of a security state or a surveillance state imposed on the so-called democracies. So it's from that background that this idea initially came up that maybe we should have a further redefinition of the unilateral order. Now, part of the reason for this and the impulse for it came as we're seeing a decline of the power of the United States because of the economic collapse that's been underway for many, many years, as forecast by Lyndon LaRouche in 1971, and then again in the mid-1980s when the Soviet Union rejected his proposal for the SDI, and he forecast the fall of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell, he said if the US doesn't change its ways, its financial system and its economy will collapse. And we're seeing that happening now at the same time that China is emerging as a competitor, according to the Warhawks, but as a very strong global economy, which does not accept the unipolar world. Now, in the State Department, one of the people in that policy planning group was a guy named Ash Jain. And he later went from the State Department to the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a think tank which was set up to coordinate U.S.-British policy, I think in 1961, funded by all the military-industrial complex firms, the defense contractors, the corporate conglomerates, and it's essentially has a very large staff. And according to someone I spoke to there, there's a lot of interaction with MI6. You have rotating positions from British intelligence into the Atlantic Council staffers. Now, in 2014, Ash Jain launched a project called the D10 Strategic Forum. D10, a reference to the G7, plus Australia, India, and South Korea. Note that two of them, India, a former British colony, although India does stand on its own as a sovereign nation, but Australia is part of the Five Eyes. The idea was that you can't do things within the UN Security Council because China and Russia have a veto. The United Nations is too large and awkward to have some kind of policy platform to defend the rules-based order. The G7 is too small, the G20 is too mixed, so you need a new platform of approximately 30 core countries, which are the world's leading democracies. And what they defined was as the basis for membership is shared values and interests, as well as defining the countries that, quote, possess the requisite diplomatic, economic, and military resources to act on a global scale, unquote. Now, this was brought to the G7 summit this June in England when Boris Johnson said that the G7 should move toward the D10. And he called it his D10 initiative. And at the time, he stressed bringing in India, Australia, and South Korea. Now, let me just give you an insight as to who one of the leading promoters of this D10 is at the Atlantic Council. A former U.S. ambassador named Daniel Freed spent 40 years at the State Department. He was ambassador to Poland. He was a coordinator of Eastern Europe policy. From 2013 to 2017, he was the coordinator of sanctions policy for the U.S. government. And he said that he, along with Blinken, was involved in putting forward the sanctions against Russia after Russia's response to the Ukraine coup in 2014. He's very proud of that. And he said he worked closely with Biden, the Biden team, with Nuland and Blinken. Now, this whole idea of the D10 is that the countries that don't accept the rules-based order have to be cut out on trade, on economics, with sanctions, with a policy which punishes them for their authoritarian ways. Now, Dr. Andrei Kortunov of the Russian International Affairs Council asked an interesting question. He said, how is it democratic to insist there's only one development model which is acceptable? This is a return to the Project for a New American Century, the PNAC unilateralism, that the West prevailed in the Cold War, and this is the only acceptable model. Well, that model's collapsing now. The model is based on a free trade policy, which is destroying the advanced sector countries, even as it's escalating the looting of the poorest post-colonial world. We see the same unilateralism in the Glasgow Climate Summit, the idea that everyone has to accept zero carbon-based policy, even though the science is fraudulent and the result will be the lack of energy to power the advanced sector countries, but also as leaders from Africa, from India, from Indonesia, and other countries said, this is a new form of colonialism, carbon colonialism. And ultimately, the other aspect of this is that it eliminates the idea of national sovereignty. And that's what the Great Reset is about. You're putting in the hands of central bankers the power not only to control financial flows and monetary policy, but spending policy. This is being enforced by a compact of bankers organized by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, in which they say that if you invest in any industry that has a carbon footprint, you'll be cut off, that the credit will be shut down to construction companies, to transportation companies, to power companies that produce carbon dioxide. This is a dictatorship. How is this democratic? Now, one further question to ask then. These are the initiation of this, the United States, the British, and NATO. These are the countries which have been engaged in one regime change after another in the last 2 decades, going back to the reaction to the attacks on 9/11. Regime change in Afghanistan, where when the U.S. finally left after 20 years, the country is in a shambles. And instead of helping to provide for people who were victims of 40 years of war, the U.S. is holding on to $9.5 billion of money that belongs to the Afghan people, while you have millions facing starvation, a cold winter. How is that democratic? You have the regime change in Iraq, the regime change in Libya, in Ukraine, the attempted regime change in Syria. Are these examples of democracy? So I just wrote an article talking about this as the summit of hypocrisy. But what's especially important to realize is that the people who are running it are people who are trying to sabotage any potential for positive negotiations and cooperation between the United States and Russia and the United States and China. And if you look at the language that's used at this summit against Putin in particular, that he's an authoritarian, he's against democracy, he's against free speech, he's shutting down opposition political parties. Well, let's look at the United States. The best example of this kind of authoritarianism was the treatment given to Lyndon LaRouche, the best economic forecaster of the last 50 years, who consistently intervened globally to provide an alternative to the collapsing financial system, which is on the verge of implosion today. He was constantly slandered. Our publications were shut down. Our writers were put in prison. Lyndon LaRouche was imprisoned. And there was nothing but a vilification and slander regime against him for his lasting till the day he died, including in the obituaries that were written at the time of his passing. That's democracy. And then let's look at another case, that of Julian Assange. The High Court in Great Britain just certified that he will be extradited to the United States. And the Biden administration is continuing to insist on that extradition. What crime did Assange commit? He published documents showing actions of war criminals in the U.S. military and intelligence community. It's the war criminals who should be put on trial. If you're an actual democracy, you don't punish the whistleblowers. More whistleblowers were punished under the Obama administration, and many of those in around Biden today were veterans of that Obama administration. So the Assange case and the LaRouche case in themselves demonstrate the fraud of this idea of the Summit for Democracy. Now, how do you deal with this? Well, we can talk about this in the Q&A, but at the same time, Mrs. LaRouche warned that we're still sitting on a powder keg. She made a very important point. We need more voices with the courage to address this war threat. Don't worry about people saying you're an alarmist. This is using fear. The use of fear is to convince you that you have to submit to this unilateral system, which is driving us to the brink of war, including nuclear war. And so individuals like Tulsi Gabbard should be encouraged. But what of all the other people in government, in institutions, who are aware that this policy, if it's carried out, could lead to nuclear war? They have to come out, and we have to encourage them. We need a movement that addresses this fraud in the name of democracy, which is actually a policy of war. So that's basically what I wanted to present today.